de-escalation today, but that is not what is happening. Benjamin Netanyahu says he's determined to continue the Gaza offensive. As violence rages on for a 10th day, Hamas has responded with renewed rocket fire into Israel, sending people there running for cover. Also coming up tonight, clashes in Chad as protesters there call for civilian rule to be restored 1 month after a military takeover. And Spain accuses Morocco of failing to stop migrants crossing into the Spanish enclave of Ceuta. Thousands have made the journey this week, with many swimming across only to be sent back. And cafes in Vienna and Paris open for business as the European Union agrees to reopen its borders to travelers who are fully vaccinated against the coronavirus. I'm Brent Goff. It's good to have you with us. We begin tonight with the growing international push for a truce between Israel and Hamas militants in Gaza. For the first time, U.S. President Joe Biden has urged Israel to significantly de-escalate its offensive in Gaza by the end of today. But Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he is not backing down, saying the offensive will continue until its objectives are achieved.
Israeli tanks again fire on targets in the Gaza Strip. Israel's military says the attacks are aimed at facilities belonging to Hamas and Islamic Jihad. In Tel Aviv, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu provided information on targets that had already been hit. He said the attacks would continue. Israel would either beat Hamas or deter them.
I have to say, we don't rule out anything. We hope we can restore quiet. We hope we can restore it quickly. I want to say that we're doing that while doing our utmost to avoid civilian casualties.
The Israeli army shelled the Gaza Strip on Tuesday night, targeting Hamas's tunnel systems in southern Gaza. They said they took aim at some 50 targets. Images of destruction on the 10th day of the military conflict. The local health ministry reported 6 casualties, with 8 people injured. While international diplomats strive for a ceasefire, in the West Bank, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas called for an immediate stop to the fighting. The attacks and destruction in Gaza are Israeli occupation-led state terrorism, a war crime that is punishable by international law. An end to fighting in the Middle East still seems a long way off.
All right, for more now, we want to go to our correspondent, Dana Regev in Tel Aviv. Good evening to you, Dana. Let's start with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He says he doesn't rule out reoccupying Gaza. What would that mean?
Well, Brent, it wouldn't be unreasonable to assume that more than an imminent threat, this is somewhat of a wink towards Hamas and Islamic Jihad leaders. The last thing Netanyahu and the Israeli military need now is actually a ground operation or reoccupying the Gaza Strip. In fact, no Israeli soldier has set foot into the Gaza Strip since 2005, in what has later become known as the Gaza disengagement. So I would assume that this is more of a hint or an implication that if so-called dragged into such reaction, Israel is indeed able to reoccupy the Strip. However, it is very unlikely that Netanyahu or the IDF, the Israeli military, would see this as their goal or aspiration.
U.S. President Joe Biden told Netanyahu that he expects to see de-escalation with Hamas by the end of today. That is not happening. What does that tell us then about U.S. influence on Israel?
Right. Well, so the United States is most definitely Israel's strongest ally. So that is definitely not a country that Israel wants to alienate. However, the Biden administration is also using terminology that we have not seen before in Israel. Biden and Netanyahu both had 4 talks in the past week, and this is the first time where Biden does not offer his support, does not declaringly say that Israel has the right to defend itself, but in fact says quite loud and clear, this is your responsibility, Netanyahu, to de-escalate the situation, which also tells us whom Joe Biden believes has the authority and the power to bring about that ceasefire, and he is definitely moving it to Netanyahu's hands.
And what about the Europeans? Germany's Foreign Minister Heiko Maas, he'll be traveling to the Middle East to hold talks. Could his visit help move things towards a ceasefire?
Right, Brent. So we are expecting here in Israel visits of more than just Heiko Maas. Other foreign ministers from the EU are expected to arrive Thursday. And indeed, more than it might bring about the ceasefire, this is potentially a sign that a ceasefire is approaching, is in the horizon. What we know is that Israel's foreign minister, Gabi Ashkenazi, he sees this visit, or he invited the foreign ministers from the EU in order to, and I quote, show support and solidarity with Israel's target, with Israel's goal of fighting and deterring Hamas. However, from the European side, Heiko Maas, Germany's foreign minister, will also meet Palestinian prime minister, and hopefully to all sides, this will help to speed up the ceasefire that is already on the horizon, also with the involvement of some sources in Egypt.
Okay, our DW correspondent Dana Regev with the latest on the situation between Israel and the Palestinians tonight. Dana, thank you. And on this week's edition of Conflict Zone, a top Israeli official tells Tim Sebastian that Israel is in no rush to reach a ceasefire.
Well, a ceasefire in itself is not an aim. The aim mustn't be just to have a ceasefire, because every other time,
it's a start.
But every time we've had a ceasefire, the ceasefire has only ever lasted 24, 48 hours, a week or 2 weeks, or it's ended up being that Israel does the ceasing and Hamas do the firing. We need to make sure that whatever happens now, we have a sustainable period of calm, so that this is not something that happens again in a few months' time, but rather Hamas understand that attacking Israel is not worth their while, and we will have a long period without any conflict. That's in the interest of both Israelis and Palestinians.
And you can see that entire interview right after this program, or you can watch it online at dw.com. Well, the conflict in the Middle East is also being felt here in Germany. Anti-Semitic slogans were chanted during recent street protests, fanning concerns among Germany's leaders. In a parliamentary debate on escalation of the Mideast conflict, Foreign Minister Heiko Maas called for a crackdown on anti-Semitism in the country. Maas said that people who preach hate and commit acts of violence will feel the full force of the law. He said anti-Semitism has no place in German culture. Germany's President Frank-Walter Steinmeier made a similar statement today.
I hope I have made it clear enough in my public statements and speeches that hatred of Jews is unacceptable in any form. And where criticism of the Israeli government and government policy turns into anti-Semitic slogans, then, as I have explicitly said, that is an abuse of the freedom of demonstration. Where this takes place, where anti-Semitic slogans are shouted, where flags with the Star of David are burnt, where attacks on synagogues have taken place, these are not ordinary transgressions, but criminal offences that must be prosecuted accordingly. And that is why I say it again here. Nothing at all of what is currently taking place in the Middle East justifies attacks on Jews here in Germany.
That was the German president speaking earlier today. Let's take a look now at some of the other news making headlines around the world. Thousands of French police officers have protested outside Parliament in Paris. They're demanding better protection and harsher punishment for attacks against them. The protest comes 2 weeks after an officer was shot dead while on duty in the southern city of Avignon. In at least 20 Danish cities, protests have taken place against the repatriation of Syrian refugees. Authorities recently revoked the residency permits of more than 200 Syrians. Many have lived in Denmark for years and with their families and will now be separated. Earlier this year, the Danish government declared parts of Syria safe enough for refugees to return. Public health officials in Malawi have burned thousands of expired vials of AstraZeneca vaccine. The country's health minister says national policy prohibits the use of expired medicines, even if World Health Organization guidance allows old shots to be used. Officials also say the incineration of the expired doses will not interfere with the goal of vaccinating 11 million people in Malawi. It has been a month since the president of Chad, Idris Deby, died and the military takeover that followed. Since then, political unrest and violent protest has engulfed the country. Demonstrators again took to the streets today in the capital, N'Djamena. Earlier this week, DW spoke to young people who had gathered to pay their last respects to a protest leader who was shot dead. Protesters have been calling on the army to return power to civilians. They're accusing France and the African Union of being complicit in the power grab. DW's West Africa correspondent Fred Bavuni reports.
Emotions are running high in Chad's capital, N'Djamena. These people are gathered at a hospital mortuary to pick up a body. The victim died of injuries he sustained when the military opened fire on protesters. And there appears to be no end in sight to tragedies like this, now that General Mahamat has taken over power after his father Idris Deby was killed. These young people are angry because of the death of one of them. He was shot, killed, while he was protesting against a military takeover. But they are also protesting against France, accusing France of complicity in all crimes being committed in Chad. The resentment on the streets is palpable.
We are tired. No to France. Leave us alone. It's too much.
We are graduates, but we have no jobs. But somebody who never went to school is in power and killing us. An idiot cannot govern us. Chad belongs to you. At the home of the deceased, family and friends come to pay their last respects and to comfort the grieving family members. He's not the last sacrifice. We are sad, but our brother died for a cause. We will keep his legacy. As families grieve, this government official says the situation is under control. He also promises that protests will be allowed in future, but on the condition that protesters remain peaceful.
There are 2 or 3 quarters in N'Djamena that have been affected by the protests. For now, the security forces have maintained the order.
The crackdown on protesters has so far led to 13 deaths, according to the opposition. Dozens have also been arrested. Activists are now calling for an investigation into the death.
All right, that report was by DW's West Africa correspondent, Fred Mavunyi. He joins me now from N'Djamena. Good evening to you, Fred. A deadly crackdown in Chad. There have been clashes between security forces and protesters today as well. What more do we know tonight?
Today, as we had in the report, this was 1 month after President Idris Deby died on battlefront, and actually another 1 month after President Mahamat, the military general who took over after his father. And people went on the street, tried to protest, but the military and the police had heavily deployed and arresting people who tried to come out from their houses to protest. And even as when we tried to go out to cover this story, they couldn't even allow us to.